Now I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker this evening. Michael Medved is a nationally syndicated radio host, best-selling author, and veteran film critic. His daily 3-hour broadcast reaches more than 3.5 million listeners on nearly 200 stations across the country, drawing an audience that consistently ranks his show as one of the top 10 political talk shows in the United States. Born in Philadelphia, Michael attended Yale as a National Merit Scholar, graduating with honors as an American History major. He then attended Yale Law School, where his classmates included Bill and Hillary Clinton. That must have been interesting. Before going to work as a political speechwriter and consultant for a variety of liberal candidates and office holders. Michael Medved is a Hollywood screenwriter and movie critic, first on CNN and then with the New York Post before launching his radio show in 1996. Medved is the author of several books, including Right Turns and Hollywood versus America, and he writes a popular daily blog on townhall.com. Mr. Medved has been a frequent guest on all the major TV talk shows, including Larry King Live, Nightline, Oprah, David Letterman, Good Morning America, and countless others. PJTN is honored to include Michael Medved among our distinguished list of International Advisory Board members. Michael lives in Seattle with his 3 children and his wife. Please join me in welcoming Michael Medved.
And I promise we're not going to do a modern-day adaptation of Long Day's Journey into Night here. It's the hour is late, and I do want to say thank you, Lori. It's such an honor to be here. Mentioning that we live in Seattle, much more importantly, I made my first trip to Israel when I was 6 months old, and I just had this burning desire that I couldn't, actually it was my parents, may they rest in peace. And my father, during the last 19 years of his life, actually was able to achieve that dream. And it was because my father went to Israel, and then my brother followed and went to Israel and raised his 4 children there, that I've had the wonderful zechut, the wonderful merit of reconnecting with my long-lost cousin, Rabbi Hausman, who we heard from before. We didn't know each other. And it turns out our great-grandparents were siblings, which is kind of amazing. I mean, it's real cousins. But that's... and that's part of the feeling I have tonight at dinner and being with all of you with PJTN. It does feel like a family reunion, doesn't it? With all of the people from so many different faith traditions and so many different corners of the Christian world and of the Jewish world and so many different corners of the country, but all coming together here. And oh, is the timing wonderful, because this is a terrific, uplifting event to see that magnificent movie that is so filled with information that every American needs to encounter, needs to confront. I hope that this is seen not by millions of Americans, but by hundreds of millions of Americans. And I know that with Lori's energy, there's a chance that it will get that kind of audience. If anyone can do it, she can. This timing, as I mentioned, is terrific, because tonight was the end of the Sochi Olympics, and 1 week from tonight is the Oscars. So in between those rather sleazy events and unpleasant events, we have this, which is a very, very different kind of experience. I want to speak to you very briefly about what it is that we are confronting, why it is so important that the message of Israel indivisible be extended and spread and brought forward as powerfully as possible. And the truth of the matter is that to understand what we are confronting in the world right now, and to understand the BDS movement, which is powerful in universities, it's powerful in corporations, it's particularly powerful in Europe, it's infected some of the most powerful European banking interests already. The BDS movement stands for boycott, divest, and sanction. As if Israel were the single most evil nation in the world. The people pushing for boycotting and divestiture and for sanctions against Israel have not pushed the same thing against North Korea. But that's, by the way, reflective of polling that has been done. There are two polls that knocked me out. One that came out a couple of weeks ago, and another one that came out in 2012. The one that came out in 2012 was a BBC poll where they reached 70,000 people around the world, and they dealt with 70 different nations in the world, and they were trying to determine the nation that was most popular and least popular and everything in between. Can anyone here, this is a little trivia question, according to the BBC, the most popular nation in the world, the one that had the highest level of people approving of that nation, saying they had a positive impression, as opposed to saying they had the negative impression. Most popular nation in the world, anyone? Israel? No. You wish. Israel was actually the least popular nation in the world. According to the BBC, Israel was less popular than North Korea or Iran or Pakistan or than Sierra Leone or Rwanda. Israel was the least popular nation on planet Earth. Okay? The most popular nation? Germany. Yes. Now, look, thank God I have great respect for Chancellor Angela Merkel. And my family left Germany, my mother's family. My grandfather left Germany in 1934, thank God, and then helped to get other family members out. But what a world we live in. Israel is the least popular nation in the world, and Germany is the most. What is it exactly that Germany does for the rest of the world? I mean, they make nice cars. Congratulations on that. And they do keep the European economy afloat. That's true. The second poll, the second survey, asked which nation was the most dangerous nation in the world. This was done by Pew Research, and it just came out in 2014. And, okay, the most dangerous nation in the world? Israelis were very relieved it wasn't Israel. Israel was fourth. Israel was fourth. Here were the rankings of the most dangerous nations in the world. Third was North Korea. Iran was fifth, by the way, lower than Israel. Israel's more dangerous than Iran. Third was North Korea. Second was Pakistan. And the most dangerous nation on planet Earth, the United States of America. Of course. And this focuses something very, very important and something that we need to understand. And please do not leave here tonight without taking this home with you. Israel is not alone in receiving unmerited, visceral, irrational, poisonous, deadly hatred from the rest of the world. Because that other flag over there right now also receives that kind of hatred, and the new form of poisonous, loathing, hostility, deadly hatred is anti-Americanism. What is it about these two nations, which are, in my opinion, and I would imagine the opinion of almost everyone here, the two greatest nations on the planet, that so much attracts so much hostility that there are people in obscure corners of the world who are willing to blow themselves into little bloody chunks of flesh with the hope of killing a few Americans, or even better, killing a few Jews? What is it? I want to submit that there are three things. There is number one, what this movie addresses so squarely, which is the idea that America and Israel have no right to exist. Number two, there is the chosen people concept. And number three, there is the entanglement of both nations with a biblical God. Let me explain. First of all, one of the things that drives me crazy, and there are very few things on the radio show. I try to be civil. I try to engage in ongoing conversation. One of the very few things that can provoke me on the radio is when people talk about Israel's right to exist. They say, what is Israel's right to exist? Now, from now on, I can say you should watch Israel Indivisible, and you'll know. But basically, my normal answer is, okay, what's France's right to exist? No, seriously, think about it. Why does France exist? Really? I mean, because the world needs cheese? I don't know. Fine wine? Why does France exist? France exists because there have been a lot of French people who've lived there for a long time, and they organized a nation, and then it grew, and it went this way, and it went that way, and it was a royal nation, and then a Burgundy separated, and then it was a Napoleonic nation, a big empire. France exists. It exists. People built it. It's there. Israel's right to exist is the fact that with God's help, the Jewish people rebuilt their ancient homeland. It is an existing nation. And here, this goes directly to the United States. A couple of books ago, I wrote this book, and I'm proud that it was a New York Times bestseller, The 10 Big Lies About America. The first big lie about America is that America has no right to exist. We stole the land from Native Americans. We committed genocide against Native Americans. We ripped off the land. What right do we have to exist? Let me mention something to you. And please, Americans understand instinctively when people say that. How can you say that? There are probably people in this room whose grandparents have been here came here hundreds of years ago. Grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. My wife's family is very interesting. My wife is a fifth-generation Angelino. Her grandfather started the first Jewish newspaper in California in 1894. Really. Okay, that's a long time. And Americans hear that. What right does America have to exist? Americans built this country. And by the way, the American right to exist, I hate to say it, is far more questionable than the Israeli right to exist. No one claims an ancient heritage in this land. I mean, no one believes that before the Pilgrims and William Bradford set sail on the Mayflower that their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were living in Massachusetts. They weren't. They weren't. They were probably living in Denmark somewhere because they were Angles and Saxons. That didn't exist. And there were no international organizations like the League of Nations or like the United Nations, to confer a legal right to exist to the United States. Why does the United States exist? Because people came to this country, they saw an opportunity. There was a continent that was deeply underpopulated, and it was. Right now, and this is very important, there are more Native Americans in America today than there were when the Pilgrims landed. And by the way, the main reason there aren't even far more is because many Indians were what are called praying Indians. They became Christians and they assimilated. And there was intermarriage of a great deal. You understand, remember Bill Clinton announced that he was part Cherokee? And everybody wanted to be part Cherokee. Elvis was part Cherokee. I hate to say that in Tennessee. I know it's the wrong city in Tennessee, but okay. But the whole idea that there was some kind of genocide or cleansing, there wasn't. 98%. The first big lie about America is that lie about genocide, organized genocide against Native Americans. Historians agree on this. And literally, even the most crazy left-wing historians, 98% of the deaths of Native Americans were not through wars or massacres. They were through disease, particularly measles and smallpox, which was devastating. And look, the idea in Israel, and this is so very important, this is something you can take to the bank too, and please remember this. The line is that Israel drove out the Palestinians. It isn't true. It isn't true. Israel pulled in the Palestinians. How do we know that? When Warder Cresson became the first U.S. consul to the city of Jerusalem, appointed by a Tennessean, by James Knox Polk. When Warder Cresson went to Jerusalem, the population of Jerusalem was 20,000, with a Jewish plurality. More Jews than Christians or Muslims in Jerusalem. Yes, really, in 1847. Remarkable, isn't it? And Warder Cresson comes in. What an interesting, do anybody else here know about Warder Cresson? Avi Lipkin probably does. No. Warder Crescent was an amazing guy because Jerusalem was a little nothing town. And I'm sorry this is a digression, but it's so fascinating and it moves me so deeply. This was a guy who was raised Quaker in Philadelphia. He left the Quakers to join Joseph Smith and to become a Mormon. He left the Mormons to become a Baptist. He had a tough time making up his mind, okay? He became a Baptist. While he was a Baptist, and he was a pastor and a lawyer and a very interesting guy, accomplished guy, God spoke to him and said, on the wings of eagles, I will bring my people back to Jerusalem. He said, wait a minute, what's the national symbol of the United States? The eagle. He wrote to President Polk. He said, it is my mission in life to try to help the Jewish people come home to their land. You don't have a consul in Jerusalem. Well, yeah, Jerusalem wasn't a capital of anything. It was just a little regional city in part of the Ottoman Empire. So President Polk said, if you pay your own expenses, you can go and be the American consul general in Jerusalem. He spent the rest of his life in Jerusalem, began, this is all true, you can look it up, it's one of the most fascinating stories. This is a great movie, Lori. So Warder Crescent spends his life trying to feed, there were literally poor and starving Jews in Jerusalem at that time, tries to encourage other European Jews to come to Jerusalem, and begins studying with some of the rabbis there. He converted to Judaism. And by the way, wrote several very interesting religious books under his new name, Michael ben Avraham. In Jewish terms, you always say that a convert is ben Avraham. He is the son of Abraham, who was the first convert to Judaism. And in any event, this entire process, this entanglement of America with Israel was very profound. But here is what you need to know, is that the British didn't do a lot that was great during their time in Jerusalem, their time in the Holy Land, their time in what later became Israel. But one thing they did do is they took pretty good censuses. And what they found is that between the years 1920, when they took a census, and 1940, when they did another census in the middle of the war, what happened to the Palestinian population? First of all, the Jewish population during that time period just about tripled. People were pouring into Israel from all over the world. And by the way, the population grew faster then than it did after the Holocaust. Why? Because there was no entrance to Israel permitted because of another white paper, not the 1922 white paper featured in the movie. So the Jewish population just about tripled. The Palestinian population grew faster. The Palestinian population soared. Why? Because all sorts of people moved in from Egypt and from Syria and from the rest of the Arab world because there was economic activity all of a sudden. There were a lot of Jews who were learning how to farm, who were building a city. The first new Jewish city in 2,000 years in Tel Aviv, built on sand dunes, not on the wreckage of any Palestinian settlements. This is so important. America was not built by destroying other people. America was built by the hard work and the sacrifice and people's great-great-great-grandparents fighting in the Revolution and fighting in the Mexican War and fighting in the war between the states and fighting in World War I. People defending this country. And Israel just has a more compressed time frame. But it's the same basis. The right to exist is the right of commitment and sacrifice and building and creating a nation with God's help. So the entire answer that needs to come to what was Israel's right to exist, Israel's right to exist was the Jewish people, with God's help, having called this land into existence. And that brings me to the second thing that people are very, very worried about, and that people have very much that they hold against the United States, and they hold against the Jewish people and against the state of Israel. This idea of a chosen people. What makes you so great? Who said, There's a British poet named Hilaire Belloc who once said, "How odd of God to choose the Jews." And to which a famous rabbi answered, "But not so odd as those who choose a Jewish God but hate the Jews." But in any event, it's pretty good one-upsmanship, don't you think? Yeah. The idea of the chosen people is so much misunderstood. And the same is true for America's sense of this nation's destiny. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, more than a chosen people, Jews have always been the choosing people, the people of choice. The Medrash, which is the ancient transmission of information that we believe goes all the way back to Moses, talks about how it is that God decided to give this precious gift of his word to those 600,000 adult males gathered at Mount Sinai a long time ago. Why this people? And it is said he went to all of the peoples on the earth and he said, "I have a law to give." And they said, "What's in it?" And to one people, he said, "Well, it says no stealing." I said, "That's not for us. That's not our tradition. That's not our heritage. That's not our lifestyle." To another people, he said, "It says don't murder." And they said, "Wait a minute, murder's what we do. Murder is us. We'll pass." And finally, he comes to the Jewish people after going to all the 70 other nations of the world. He comes to the Jewish people and he says, "I have a law to give you." And the Jewish people say, "We will do it and we will come to live it and understand it." And it's on that basis, that choice. And in every generation, Jewish people have chosen to remain Jewish. Here's an amazing statistic. And this is because, like I mentioned, the British take pretty good censuses. The Romans took pretty good censuses. And before the Judean War, and this is in Josephus, the estimate of the Jewish population of the Roman Empire was 7 million people, which is unbelievable. The estimate is it was about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. Today, there are 13 million Jews in the world. What happened to all those missing Jews? If there was a natural rate of accretion, we'd be about as numerous as the Chinese today. So what happened? In every generation, there were people who chose not to keep the covenant, not to identify as Jews. God knows it's inconvenient. But I know, because I'm standing here and those others of you here who have Jewish heritage, that someone in your family made a conscious choice. Father and grandmother and great-grandmother and great-grandfather made a choice that we will keep this alive. This is the sense of chosenness. And by the way, the same thing is true of the United States. And this only America and Israel have in common. People are here today, everyone who is here today, because you had an ancestor, you had a great-grandfather or grandfather or grandmother who chose to come to this country. Now, that, by the way, I thank God every day that my grandparents chose to come to this country. I mean, it's unbelievable. My father's family came from Ukraine. They could be there now, which would be deeply problematic, but they probably wouldn't have been there because they probably would have been killed by Hitler and by the local collaborationists. It's an amazing thing. We are here as Americans because someone chose it. Now, someone will say, well, what about African Americans? It's true. But you know what? This is fascinating, and I found this out very recently. Do you know that the majority of the African American population in America today is people whose ancestors did not come in slavery, but who immigrated to this country after slavery? From the West Indies, from Nigeria. Nigerian Americans, rapidly growing population, and by the way, doing very well in our country. And so even among African Americans, there is, at least for a slight majority, this element of choice. And this is different from any other nation. America is the only nation, I should say the first nation, not to be based upon an accident of birth, but to be based upon a good idea. The idea that here the people rule. Here we have no kings, no emperors. We have only the King of Kings, the God we serve, which was the idea behind this country. And by the way, Israel, the second nation to be based upon a good idea. And by the way, this is something I identify with. Theodor Herzl, who you saw briefly in the film there, you know what his profession was? He was a drama critic. He wasn't just a journalist, he reviewed plays. Makes me feel a little bit better about all those years I wasted reviewing movies. Theodor Herzl reviewed plays in Vienna. And he was not a religious man, though he became more religiously interested, at least toward the end of his life. But he had this good idea, which, by the way, came after a bunch of American Christians had that good idea. You know, one of the things that was fascinating, we heard before from Dr. Lutzer from the Moody Church. Theodore Dwight Moody had a colleague named William Blackstone, who was one of the great evangelists of the 19th century. And he put together the Blackstone Memorial between 1891 and 1893. It was a petition to President Benjamin Harrison, signed by 100 distinguished Americans, including J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, right, of Standard Oil, and Speaker of the House William McKinley, right, future president, asking the American government to use our armed services to help bring the Jews back to their homeland. Now, why is the date important? Because it's before Herzl wrote The Jewish State and before the first Zionist Congress. And were the Christians doing this because they were doing it out of love, which has been a characteristic of American Christians from the beginning of this republic. John Adams wrote a letter in 1819 to Mordechai Manuel Noah, who was the first Jewish diplomat ever for this country. He was our consul in Tunis. And John Adams, second president, who was an old man then, he died in 1826. He wrote this letter in 1819, and he said, I envision that someday the Jews will constitute a mighty army more glorious than the French army. He said it. More glorious than the French army. And they will lead their brethren in joy and triumph back to Jerusalem. John Adams. American Christianity has always been different. Different. And that element of chosenness, of choice, of the choice to be Israeli, which is the choice my brother made. That element of the choice to be American, that makes our two countries very, very different. And yes, provokes some hatred and resentment. And that brings me to the final point that provokes hatred and resentment, which is the entanglement with providence, with God. It is impossible. It is impossible to look at the emergence of this great country and that great flag, and this great country and this great flag, and not to see the hand of the Almighty. It is impossible. There's a professor of history at University of Pennsylvania, he just retired, whose work I like a great, great deal, named Walter McDougall. And McDougall asks a question. He says, imagine looking at the world 500 years ago. Look at the world in 1500, shortly after Columbus sails. And what would you find? There's a lot of violence going on in the Islamic world, and they're very happily and busily killing each other. Japan is very arrogant and somewhat isolated. The Chinese empire is mighty and powerful and prosperous, but crumbling. Russia is the country of the future and always will be. No, the Russian Empire was supposed to be, mighty and future. You saw the opening statement at Sochi. Britain has a tremendous culture. It's a small country, but it punches beyond its weight and looks down its nose at everyone else. France, even more so, with much less reason. In Latin America, you have these great civilizations, very populous, but very brutal with lots of violence. Okay, a traveler, a time traveler, could recognize the world. If somebody traveled in time from 1500 to 2014, he could recognize the world. Different nations, the same nations. The one thing he could never anticipate is the United States of America. That in North America, sparsely populated, in this massive continent, including all of Canada, everything north of Mexico, 3 million people, that's all. And no civilization, no cities. And on this spot of land, the dominant civilization in the world emerges. How do you explain it? And this is precisely the problem, and the same problem Israel has, is you have only 3 possible ways to explain it. Either it's a coincidence, it's a crime, or it's God. It has to be one of the 3. The idea that it's a coincidence, the good luck that America has had, I mean luck, right? Religious people don't believe in luck. Religious people don't believe in coincidence. You know, the fact that Napoleon gets this fit of stupidity and decides, you know, we own about a third of the continent and this Louisiana territory, we're going to sell it for $15 million. Now, Jefferson doesn't believe that it's his presidential prerogative to buy this land, but he says, you know what, this is too good to be true. He violates his principles. He buys Louisiana. Otherwise, in Tennessee, we're not here, right? I mean, I know Tennessee, most of Tennessee is not in Louisiana Purchase, and that was already being settled. But okay, fine. The point is, none of it is luck. It is all providence. And previous generations of Americans knew it. And Israel. The preposterousness of Israel's victory in the war for independence. The late Otto Preminger, who was a Hollywood director, had a lifelong dream of doing. He's the one who directed Exodus, which is the last good movie that Hollywood made about Israel. Before, this is not made by Hollywood, before Israel Indivisible. But he made Exodus in 1967, and 66 actually. And he had the dream of making Genesis 1948 about the war for independence. And those Jews who, quote, control Hollywood, shot him down. Wouldn't allow him to do it. It's never been done. But you know, there's so much to be done. This is one of the things that's so exciting about PJTN. There are great stories, and look at what Lori and Stan could do here. And so many of these stories need to be told. I know these are part of the plans for the future, is to tell some of the inspiring stories. But seriously, if you read some of the stories of what they called the Burma Road, the relief of Jerusalem, which was being boycotted and starved to death, the heroics of the young men, many of whom said, you know, I don't believe in God. But you know what? They asked the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Kook, what do you say about young men who give their life defending this land? But they're atheists. He says, they're not atheists. They have died al-Kadush Hashem. They have died as a sanctification of God's name because they gave their lives to protect God's stake in history. And that's the key thing. That it's not simply that God supports and protects Israel and the United States, but that our countries protect God and his role in history. You cannot look at these two nations and their history and deny the hand of providence. And let me conclude with this. It's a beautiful thing I actually heard last night. We had a scholar in residence. I want to give it. You know, it's an old Jewish saying, and some of our Jewish friends will recognize it, that if you say over something wise in the name of the person who originated it, it helps to bring Messiah, or helps to bring Messiah back. You know, that's of course the first question. When Messiah comes, we know he comes to the gates of Jerusalem. And we should all go out together, Jews and Christians, join hands. And of course, the first question, as indicated, will be, Is this your first visit to our city? In any event, the point about this is it's said that if you say over something clever in the name of the person who said it, it helps to bring Messiah. Do you know why? It's so rare. People are stealing stuff all the time, so I don't want to steal this. I heard this last night. Our congregation had a scholar in residence over the Sabbath, and before I flew in here this morning. And last night he gave a presentation, and he gave a beautiful vort, a beautiful little kernel of understanding. And I hope this stays with you as it did with me. And he was asking specifically about what has been referred to here, and it's the name of a ministry and work of Wings of Eagles, and it's been referred to before. He refers to Isaiah, seeing so long ago that on the wings of eagles, God would bring his people back. And he says, imagine 1949, Yemen, one of the most endangered Jewish communities in the world. Some of our dearest friends are Yemenite Jews. But this community was poor, it was backward. Most Yemenite Jews had never seen a car. And all of a sudden, to prevent them from being slaughtered en masse, the Israelis come in with what was called Operation Magic Carpet, and they have airplanes, and they load them into airplanes, and they take 50,000 Yemenite Jews to make new homes in Israel, where they have contributed immeasurably to Israeli life. And he says, for these Yemenite Jews getting on an airplane, they were terrified, they were exhilarated. It was an airplane, they'd never seen such a thing. Now he says, try to do this mind experiment. You're the prophet Isaiah. You have a vision. And your vision shows thousands of people and these huge things that look like birds. It's the wings of eagles. It is the most clear, direct confirmation of prophecy. And then within 2 years of the fall of the old evil empire of the Soviet Union, there are 1 million, yes, 1 million Jews who come to Israel. It's unbelievable. We live in miraculous times. And David Ben-Gurion is associated with many quotes about miracles, because even though he was officially not a religious guy, he grew up in a religious home. And one of the things he is reputed to have said is said, in Israel, we don't believe in miracles. We rely on them. And so, too, we should rely on the miraculous growth of PJTN, this wonderful, wonderful organization that has continued to bless the state of Israel, just as it blesses our greatest nation on God's green earth. Thank you, thank you, thank you.